all the world's continents, Australia may be the smallest, but it's also the only one to be entirely controlled by just a single country. Almost everybody knows, though, that while Australia is a huge place in terms of land, it's also a pretty small place in terms of population. But few people really understand the absolute scale of how sparsely populated the Australian continent actually is. To help put the numbers into some perspective, Australia is of a comparable size to the lower 48 US states. These 48 US states have a population of more than 300 million people, while Australia only has a population of little more than 26 million. This means that there are 2 American states that have more people than the entirety of the Australian continent. California with more than 39 million, and Texas with more than 28 million. For a more European perspective, the population of only England, without factoring in any of the rest of the UK, is more than double the entire population of Australia. Despite being an entire continent, there are actually 7 significantly smaller islands across the world that have higher populations than Australia. Great Britain, of course, along with Honshu, Luzon, Mindanao, Java, Sumatra, and Madagascar. Java alone has nearly 6 times Australia's tiny population, despite being an island that is 60 times smaller than Australia, the continent. But it still gets even crazier because there's also a bunch of cities across the world that, right now, have more people than the entire continent as well. The Tokyo, Jakarta, and Delhi metropolitan areas all have greater populations than the entirety of Australia, while the Shanghai and Seoul metro areas have roughly similar populations. In the town of Newman, it's basically just a small town, but with the space of Japan. Then, perhaps even more strangely, there's the pastoral unincorporated area down here in South Australia. This dot is the city of Adelaide, Australia's 5th largest city, home to more than 1.3 million people. And immediately adjacent to this oasis of urban life is the pastoral unincorporated area, a territory that's roughly the size of France, but is only home to a whopping 3,750 people, making the population density something like 178 square kilometers of land for every 1 person. That is roughly 1 Aruba's worth of land for every single resident inside of the pastoral unincorporated area. Most of the problem stems from the fact that Australia is pretty uniquely cursed when it comes to both the geologic and location perspective. Located relatively close by to Antarctica, the frozen continent, the western side of Australia is continuously battered by cold ocean currents coming up from the Southern Ocean, which means that there simply isn't enough heat to generate large-scale evaporation that's necessary to form rain clouds over much of the west. Meanwhile, in the east, the Great Dividing Range is Australia's largest and longest chain of mountains, and the 5th longest anywhere in the world. These mountains run down the entire eastern side of the continent from north to south. The tallest mountain and highest point that can be found anywhere in mainland Australia is here within the Great Dividing Range, Mount Kosciuszko, and it's only 2,228 meters high above sea level. For comparison, the highest point of every single other inhabited continent is at least more than double that height, and nearly 3/4 of the entire US state of Colorado alone maintains an elevation that is significantly higher than just that one sorta tall mountain in Australia. This means that there are simply very few tall mountains to be found anywhere on the continent that are actually capable of forcing air upwards where it's possible to cool into rain. And then, to make matters even worse, that air is very often just too hot for rain to form anyway, because the continent straddles the boundary of the Tropic of Capricorn, placing a significant amount of northern Australia to be well within the tropics, and almost the rest of the continent down in the subtropic. This area of the world is dominated by the subtropical high-pressure belt that wraps around the entire globe, and it simultaneously serves to both warm and dry the air around it. So whatever air even does get pushed up by the few tall mountains in Australia has to also contend with this phenomenon. And what's even more, Australia has to also contend with the difficult-to-predict oscillations of the southern Pacific Ocean known as El Niño and La Niña. During an El Niño event, which can sometimes last for years at a time, the southern Pacific often goes through prolonged periods of slower than usual westerly winds. And that naturally means that there will be less atmospheric moisture delivered by those winds to the eastern and northern parts of the Australian continent, often accompanied by exacerbated drought-like conditions. It's unsurprising then that many of the worst bushfires in Australia's history have taken place at the exact same time as during one of these El Niño events. All of these factors converge to make Australia by far the driest inhabited continent on the Earth, with the least amount of average annual rainfall, and consequently, desert or desert-like conditions understandably exist over about 35% of the continent's total area. I mean, just take a look at this map of Australia's average rates of annual rainfall, where you can see most of the rain on the continent falls on the east coast in the stretch of land between the coastline and the Great Dividing Range, in the north that stretches into the tropics, Tasmania in the south, and around Perth in the southwest corner. It's basically an identical map with Australia's current population density pattern, except in one very interesting and notable area. Northern Australia, more than the entire average annual rainfall of London, which could give the false impression if you just looked at that single year of more rainfall here than in the UK. But then, a few decades later on in 1924, without any cyclones penetrating through to the interior here, this town only received 4 millimeters of rain throughout the whole year, which is even less than the yearly average of the Sahara Desert. But it's not just the erratic nature of the continent's rainfall that makes fresh water a scarcity here. It's also the lack of any decently large rivers. The most significant river system on the continent is the Murray-Darling Basin here in the southeast, in one of Australia's most heavily populated cores. In Northern Australia, there hasn't been any new mountain building since the Precambrian era that ended 1.5 billion years ago. And even further, there hasn't been any glacial activity here since the Carboniferous ended nearly 300 million years ago. Thus, this entire region that covers nearly half of the continent has suffered its soils being beneath continuous weathering and erosion for well over 250 million years, compared to less than 10,000 years for most of the soils on other continents like North America, Europe, or Asia. Therefore, the soil nearly everywhere in Northern Australia just sucks for agriculture. The only exception to that rule is the area of the river basin that drains here into Lake Erie. But this is an overall small amount of the north, and the rainfall required for irrigation here is still very low. But the thing is, none of these geographic or climatic explanations really give the full picture, because despite everything that I just spent the last 10 minutes explaining to you, it turns out that Australia actually has a ton of freshwater resources. Well, at least when compared to countries and not to continents. In fact, Australia has an estimated 492 cubic kilometers worth of renewable freshwater resources. Still substantially less than the population of America, but also substantially more people than Australia has today. In theory, Australia does have enough space and resources to support a lot more people than the 26 million who live there today. The big reason why it doesn't is because for pretty much the entire history of Australia, right up until the present day, it's just been a really tough place for anyone to actually get to. You see, for millions of years now, Australia has been effectively a lost continent, isolated from all the Earth's other major landmasses, drifting alone out in the sea. This has resulted in millions of years of completely separate evolution for the animals of the continent, which is why Australia is unique among Earth's continents for the fact that marsupials, and not placental mammals, dominate the indigenous mammal wildlife species. Modern humans first reached the continent sometime around 50,000 years ago, when the area's geography looked radically different than it does today.